We're going to look at the main themes, but also I'll explain them in terms of how you could explain it by analyzing the text, because that's ultimately what you have to do with the Q2 when you have the prose in front of you. And then as far as the Q3, this is the one I think you can do the best on, because you have the most control over what you say. And if you really pay attention to these videos and you're actively engaged the best way that you can be, and you're reading the material, you must read the material. I've had so many students that love listening to lectures from me, but then when it really came down to the test, because they hadn't read, they had nothing to say. And you can't just count on, spark notes and things like that. The questions are designed to make an interpretation about the text and the piece as a whole. And spark notes isn't designed that way. They're just designed. They're a tool. It's helpful. It is helpful. But again, I would, even if you were going to look at that, I would look at that before you read. And here's why: because when you're first reading classic literature, the language, the style, all of this is going to be new to you, and it's going to take a little time to get used to it. The more you read it, the better it will become. And actually, you might even develop a taste where you're kind of a snob about other literature because you're used to this expensive, rich, quality, and a text, and the other is just going to kind of fall short. That's where you want to get. But as you're reading and what other people, you've read some scholarship or you've read the author's life, you're going to read more actively than passively. If you know nothing, you're looking at a text passively, and it might just tire you out. But if you look at it more like an investigation, you're trying to get to the bottom of this. And that's what I find really exciting about literature. I have all these questions about life and philosophy and human nature and motives behind people's characteristics and why people behave the way they behave, why things happen the way that they happen. All of that is part of figuring out the story. And when you do that, you also can apply it to your own life, and you become kind of a good psychologist, even maybe for other people and for yourself, because you've read so much, you understand things better than other people who are just functioning on a superficial level, and just taking in propaganda and messages and just, making up their mind that way. You will become a critical thinker. And that's really what education is about, right? I mean, that's why we're here. That's why what we're supposed to be doing. Okay, so back to Kate Chopin's question. In this outward existence, which conforms the inward life that questions. And this is the question that we're going to use for the Great Gatsby. And if you look at Nick Carraway, I said this before in an introductory video. He says that he was within and he was without. And I just want to pause here and talk about F. Scott Fitzgerald, because as I'm studying this and reading and thinking about it, going back through the text and going back through his life, what I'm starting to see is that he is kind of between Nick Carraway and Gatsby. He happens to be right next to Gatsby in West Egg, which is the less fashionable side. And so, he says his house is an eyesore. At one point at dinner, when Daisy and Tom ask him about marriage, he says he's too poor. So this is a kind of a frustrating place to be, because he's in the upper class without actually possessing what the upper class possesses. But he feels superior to the lower class, so he is not going to be with that crowd either. And I think this is what happened to Fitzgerald, and why I say he's kind of a cross between Nick Carraway and Gatsby, is because, like Gatsby, he had to recreate himself. He had to really work to get recognition, and he did it through his writing. He was fortunate enough and smart enough to be a talented writer. But and also another similarity, you know, Gatsby's doing all this for a woman. It's questionable whether he really wants Daisy or if he really wants to be Tom in order to get Daisy. So I want to look at what does that style look like, because not only do you have to recognize it, but you have to say something about it. What happens when you read something that's stream of consciousness? Because that's got to lead you to whatever claim you're making about the theme. Okay, so I'll get there when we look at the text, but the first opening of chapter 2 is the Valley of Ashes. And this is a really important scene to remember because this is kind of the death of the American dream, right? So that you could write in your essays maybe about this lost generation, or you might be able to recognize that in this prose he uses stream of consciousness to convey what? The industrialized descriptions. If you've ever looked at Coketown in Hard Times, Hard Times, okay? I think what's interesting about this passage is the movement. It's you could even describe the musicality of a piece. He wants to show a party scene that's in and out, and kind of like even the other scene, though, because there's liquor involved, there's a little bit of a confusion and people reappearing and disappearing, and you see how many words he actually uses that show what he says at the end, this constantly changing light. He describes them like as a swell with arrivals, dissolve, form with the same breath. You see what a snob Nick is too, even though Nick is not, he's looked down upon at, you know, from people from East Egg, he still looks down from people that he feels is inferior to him. And so this is definitely just, it's not a lot about racism or anything like that, but you see that here. And I think that that's why also the names of people coming in, you start to see that there's this migration. Now, how does that fit into what you're trying to say with the American dream? Well, remember, Tom Buchanan is afraid of the rise of the colored people or whatever, and I said earlier that this threatens, you know, his civilization when he says civilization is going to pieces. So in terms of the American dream, the fact that people are coming to this country and they are starting to be able to get businesses and work, and they are entitled to the American dream too. Langston Hughes wrote a wonderful poem called I Too. I like to do, just as a juxtaposition to this, as we start getting into the idea of American identity, is to look at Jewish identity. And look, I love the play Fiddler on the Roof. It's just extraordinary. If you have never seen it, and most young people have not seen it, so please do yourself a favor and watch it. But in the beginning, he's talking about tradition, and he says, because of our tradition, every man knows who he is and what God expects him to do. Now, think about that compared to a lost generation of people, of, you know, like in the beginning when we would talk about American culture, and it's, well, what is our culture? And people would say it's kind of like we don't have one and we're like the melting pot and so on and so forth. So not having that tradition, it's very hard to say this is who we are, this is what we believe, this is our creed. Try to make sense of it. But what I'm going to suggest is that what they project onto God derives from their beliefs. So no longer are we made in the image of God, or do we make God in our own image?